The crack of bone against knuckle echoed for a split second as Officer Nolan's fist slammed into Caleb Hayes's face, the impact violent enough to whip his head back with brutal force. The handcuffed 17-year-old found his footing slowly, a universe of pain exploding behind his eye, before a rough shove sent him stumbling into the patrol car's back seat. As the vehicle lurched away from the curb, Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, focusing on the simple rhythm of his breath, in and out, knowing his father would already be glancing at the clock, wondering why he hadn't made it home from basketball practice. And he knew, with a chilling certainty that cut through the pain, that these officers, believing they were schooling some anonymous black teenager, had just ignited a firestorm that would consume their careers. For they had laid their hands on the one and only son of the state's Attorney General. The steady thump-thump-thump of the basketball on the worn pavement was the rhythm of Caleb Hayes's own heart, a confident, pulsing beat guiding him home from the sweat and grind of evening practice. The setting sun bled across the suburban landscape, casting long, dramatic shadows and bathing the world in hues of amber and crimson. At 17, Caleb moved with the fluid grace of a dedicated athlete and the quiet intensity of a scholar, his lean 6 feet 2 inches frame gliding with an easy purpose, droplets of sweat still clinging to his skin despite a fast shower after Coach Davies had finally blown the whistle. Caleb settled his headphones, letting the intricate flow of J. Cole's lyrics become a soundtrack to the mental replay of the practice. The coach had been fired up about his perimeter shooting today, even hinting he might get the start in Friday's rivalry game against Northwood High. A ghost of a smile touched his lips at the thought. Starting as a junior was a bright beacon for college scouts, one more stellar achievement to stack alongside a 3.9 GPA and his volunteer hours at the youth center. He rolled his shoulders, working out the pleasant burn of a body pushed to its limit, shifted his gym bag, and glanced at his phone. He told his father he would be home by 6:30 for dinner, leaving him a comfortable 20 minutes for the 15-minute walk. His father, Nathaniel Hayes, a man of unwavering punctuality, held timeliness as a virtue second only to integrity, a principle that had propelled him to his position as the state's Attorney General. Caleb had spent his life observing his father forge a legacy of justice and accountability, powerful lessons that had become the architecture of his own character. As he turned onto Sycamore Street, the world around him began to shift. The transition from the commercial buzz around the high school to the quiet enclave of Redwood Heights, where grand homes sat nestled behind manicured lawns and ancient trees, was a subtle gradient he'd walked 1,000 times. The yards grew larger, the cars in the driveways more luxurious, the silence deeper. It was a change he barely noticed anymore. This was his world, too, even if he still caught the occasional lingering stare when he jogged these same streets on a weekend morning. A sudden slash of red and blue light, reflecting like shattered glass off a nearby car, tore him from his thoughts. A glance over his shoulder confirmed it, a police cruiser, moving at a predatory crawl about half a block back. An instinctive tightness seized his chest, a conditioned reflex built from 17 years of his father's careful warnings. The words were a mantra. Be polite. Hands visible. No sudden moves. And above all, stay calm. Caleb nudged the volume down on his headphones but kept them on, maintaining his unhurried pace, tracking the cruiser in his periphery. The car crept closer, its speed a perfect, unnerving match for his own. The thought of calling his father flickered and died. No need to cause alarm over what was likely just a routine pass. The cruiser slid up beside him, and Caleb felt his heart kick into a higher gear despite his will to remain composed. He made fleeting eye contact with the officer in the passenger seat, a man with a stern face, close-cropped hair, and sunglasses that seemed absurd in the fading light. The officer's stare was a blank wall before he murmured something to his partner. Caleb focused on the sidewalk ahead, intensely aware of his own body, of every single movement. When the car accelerated slightly only to angle sharply toward the curb, cutting off his path, Caleb knew his simple walk home had just become a complex and dangerous equation. He stopped, pulling his headphones down to rest around his neck, his father's voice echoing in his mind. Hands where they can see them, son. Always. Two officers stepped out of the car, their movements synchronized with the easy familiarity of long-term partners. The driver, a stocky man with a florid complexion, approached with a hand resting near his sidearm, his nameplate reading "Read." The other officer, the one who had been watching him, took a wider angle, flanking him, his own tag identifying him as Nolan. "Evening," Officer Reed began, his tone a flat, neutral line, but his eyes were sharp, dissecting. "Mind telling us what you're doing in this neighborhood?" A familiar, heavy feeling settled in Caleb's gut, the exhausting weight of having to justify his own existence in a place others had decided he didn't belong. He kept his face impassive, his voice measured and respectful. "Just walking home from basketball practice, sir. I live just a few blocks from here." Officer Nolan drifted closer, his eyes raking over Caleb's athletic frame, the gym bag, the headphones, the phone still in his hand. "You have any ID on you?" Caleb gave a slight shake of his head. "No, sir. I didn't bring my wallet to practice. My house is just up on Redwood Terrace, about 3 blocks that way." The officers exchanged a look, a silent communication that sent a prickle of alarm across Caleb's skin. He knew that look. It was a cocktail of skepticism and suspicion, though he'd rarely seen it aimed at him so blatantly. This wasn't his first stop, but something in their posture, and the air crackling between them, felt different. "No ID, huh?" Officer Reed's voice took on a harder edge. "Convenient. And we're supposed to believe you live up in Redwood Heights? Those are multi-million-dollar properties, son." Caleb felt his throat tighten but forced his voice to remain steady. "Yes, sir. My father and I have lived there for 6 years. Number 347, the blue house with the white shutters." Officer Nolan took another step, deliberately breaching Caleb's personal space. "What's your name?" "Caleb Hayes, sir." "And what's your father do that he can afford a place in Redwood Heights, Caleb?" The way he said his name was a small act of disbelief, tightening the knot in Caleb's chest. "He works for the state," Caleb answered, intentionally vague. He'd learned that dropping his father's title in tense situations could sometimes feel like pouring gasoline on a spark. Officer Reed let out a short, derisive laugh. "State government, huh? Janitor, maybe?" His tone was a dismissal, a judgment already rendered. The sun had finally surrendered, and the harsh, sterile glow of streetlights began to flicker to life, chasing away the last of the day's warmth. A car passed, its driver slowing to stare at the scene on the sidewalk. Caleb felt a surge of vulnerability, knowing that to a passing stranger, he was just another stereotype, a young black man in trouble with the police, not a high school junior trying to get home for dinner. As the silence stretched, thin and sharp, Caleb felt the entire situation balancing on the razor's edge of their control, a precarious reality his father had prepared him for but could never truly shield him from. He stood perfectly still, a statue of compliance, hands visible, waiting, his composure a practiced defense in a world where his very presence could be misread as a threat. Officer Reed began to circle him slowly, the sound of his boots on the pavement a deliberate, heavy scrape, while Officer Nolan stood uncomfortably close, his presence a constant pressure. The fading light carved deep shadows onto their faces, twisting a routine stop into something that felt increasingly predatory. Caleb focused on his breath, a steady rhythm against the frantic pounding in his chest, keeping his hands open and visible at his sides, just as his father had taught him. "You know what I'm thinking?" Officer Reed said, his voice coming from directly behind Caleb. "I'm thinking we've got a kid casing these expensive houses, looking for an easy score, an unlocked window." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice from shaking. "No, sir. That's not it. I promise you I live here. If you want to follow me home, my dad can clear this all up." Officer Nolan scoffed, his breath unpleasantly warm near Caleb's ear. "Listen to him. Escort me home. Like we're his private security." He suddenly snatched Caleb's gym bag, yanking it off his shoulder. "What's in the bag?" "Huh? Anything you want to tell us about." "Just my uniform and a couple of textbooks," Caleb said, fighting the instinct to reclaim his property, as Nolan unzipped the bag and began rummaging through it with rough hands. The officer pulled out an AP Physics textbook, waving it in the air with mock surprise. Well, look at this, Reed. A regular boy genius. He tossed the book back into the bag and dumped Caleb's neatly folded uniform onto the sidewalk. Please be careful with my stuff, Caleb said, his voice softer now, the effort of maintaining his composure showing in the tightness of his words. I haven't done anything. Officer Reed moved back into his line of sight, his face hardening into a mask of authority. You want to talk about doing something? How about loitering? How about lying to a police officer? How about the attitude you're giving us right now? I'm not giving you an attitude, sir, Caleb replied, his eyes fixed on a point just past the officer's shoulder, another one of his father's lessons on de-escalation. And I'm not loitering. I live here. Officer Nolan, having found nothing of interest in the bag, now turned his attention to Caleb himself. Empty your pockets, he commanded, his gesture sharp and impatient. Caleb slowly pulled out the contents, his phone, a house key, a few dollars in change. Nolan snatched the phone, his thumb swiping at the lock screen, which showed a picture of Caleb and his father at a charity event. Nice phone for a teenager, Nolan remarked, flipping it over. Where'd you steal it? It's my phone, Caleb said, a spark of frustration finally breaking through. My father bought it for me for my birthday. Reed moved in, crowding him from the other side. Your father? The one who works for the state and owns a mansion in Redwood Heights. You really expect us to swallow that? A car slowed as it passed, the driver's face a mask of concern. For a heartbeat, Caleb hoped they might stop, that a witness might change the dynamic. But a hard glare from Officer Reed was all it took for the car to continue on its way. Look, Caleb tried, shifting his approach. You can call my father. His number's on speed dial. Or we can just walk to my house. It's right there. Officer Nolan's hand shot out, his fingers closing around Caleb's bicep like a vice. Are you trying to tell us how to do our jobs now? I think you need to learn a little respect. Caleb flinched at the biting pain but held himself still, his father's most urgent warning screaming in his mind. Don't resist, not even when they're wrong, not even when it's unfair. I respect your authority, sir. I'm just trying to resolve this. The situation, Officer Reed said, his voice a low growl, is that we have a suspicious individual with no ID in an affluent neighborhood where he doesn't belong, mouthing off to officers. He nodded at Nolan. I think it's time we continued this conversation downtown. Nolan's grip tightened as he began to steer Caleb toward the cruiser. Let's go, smartass. A few hours in a holding cell might jog your memory about where you're really from. Please, Caleb said, his voice still controlled but now laced with real alarm. Just call my father. He's expecting me. He'll be worried. Oh, Daddy's going to be worried, Nolan mocked, shoving him forward. Should have thought of that before you went for a stroll where you don't belong. Caleb stumbled, catching himself, careful to make no sudden move that could be misinterpreted. My father is Nathaniel Hayes, he said, the name a last resort, a final card to play. He's the state attorney general. For a fraction of a second both officers froze. Then they exchanged a look. Officer Reed's face darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think that's funny? You think inventing a story like that is going to help you? I'm not lying, Caleb insisted, a cold dread seeping into his bones as he realized the truth was making things infinitely worse. My father is Nathaniel Hayes, the Attorney General. You can check. The rest of the sentence was stolen from him as Officer Reed grabbed the front of his shirt, slamming him backward against the cruiser with a force that drove the air from his lungs. That's enough of your mouth, he snarled, his face inches from Caleb's. One more lie about being the Attorney General's son, and I'll add impersonating an official to the list. Caleb felt the cold shock of the car's metal against his back, the officer's forearm pressing into his chest, pinning him. This was spiraling far beyond anything his father's lessons had covered. Panic was a wild animal clawing at his throat, but he forced it down, forced himself to breathe. Hands on the hood, Officer Nolan commanded, spinning him around and kicking his feet apart. You know the routine. And Caleb did know, not from experience, but from a lifetime of observation. The ritualistic humiliation, the vulnerability of the stance, the raw assertion of power. He spread his fingers against the cool metal as Nolan began a rough, invasive pat-down, while Reed stood guard, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Officer Nolan's hands were anything but professional as they moved across Caleb's body, the pretense of a search discarded for pure intimidation. Caleb pressed his forehead against the cruiser's cool metal, his eyes squeezed shut, focusing on the in and out of his own breathing, trying to detach from the violation of a stranger's hands on his body. He's clean. Nolan finally grumbled, a note of disappointment in his voice. No weapon, no contraband. Officer Reed grunted. Turn around, he ordered. Caleb complied slowly, every movement measured and deliberate. The officer's face was flushed, his anger seemingly growing with every moment that Caleb failed to be the criminal he wanted him to be. So, you're sticking to the story? Living in Redwood Heights? Daddy is the big-shot attorney general? It's the truth, Caleb said, his voice a level line drawn over a sea of turmoil. My father is Nathaniel Hayes. 347 Redwood Terrace. Just check. Reed's hand shot out, shoving Caleb hard. I told you to drop it. You think we're idiots? You think we don't know who the Attorney General is? Caleb's back hit the car again, a jolt of pain shooting up his spine. He swallowed hard, his composure cracking under the strain. I'm not lying. Please, just call him or take me home. It's less than a 5-minute drive. You hear this kid, Nolan? Reed asked his partner with a theatrical roll of his eyes. Still talking like he's some kind of prince. Nolan shook his head, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. Yeah, and I'm the damn mayor. Look, kid, the act is over. Tell us where you really live, who you stole that phone from, and we might cut you a break. I've told you the truth, Caleb insisted, a rare heat rising in his voice. This is my neighborhood. I'm just trying to walk home. Reed leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. You calling us liars, boy? You think we don't know who belongs here and who doesn't? The word boy landed like a physical blow, heavy with a history of hate he'd only read about. He bit his cheek hard, forcing back the flood of angry words that begged to be released. Nothing to say now? Nolan taunted, moving to flank him again. Cat got your tongue? Caleb took a deep, steadying breath. I would like to call my father, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I have the right to a phone call. Reed's laugh was a harsh, ugly sound. You've been watching too much TV, kid. You're not under arrest. Yet. Right now, you're just a person of interest being questioned. And so far, your only interest is lying and copying an attitude. I haven't lied about a single thing. Caleb shot back, his patience finally snapping. He glanced at Reed's badge, searing the number into his memory. So now you're memorizing my badge number? Reed cut him off, his voice rising in pitch. You planning on filing a complaint? Is that it? No, sir. I just... Hands behind your back. Reed barked, grabbing for his handcuffs. You're being detained. A cold wave of dread washed over Caleb. On what charge? He asked, even as he complied, knowing any resistance was a death sentence. Suspicious activity? Trespassing? Interfering with an investigation? Nolan answered, wrenching Caleb's arm behind his back. And a bad attitude. Caleb winced as the cold steel bit into his wrists, ratcheted painfully tight. This is insane, he muttered, the words escaping before he could stop them. Nolan's grip became a vice. What was that? He demanded, his voice a low threat. You have something to say? Caleb shook his head. No, sir. Nah, I heard you. Nolan hissed, spinning Caleb to face him. You said this is insane, right? You think you can disrespect us? I didn't mean. The crack of bone against knuckle echoed for a split second as Officer Nolan's fist slammed into his cheekbone. The impact whipped Caleb's head to the side, sending him stumbling back against the cruiser, a universe of pain exploding behind his eye as his vision blurred. You need to learn some respect, Nolan growled, advancing again. Caleb raised his cuffed hands instinctively, a futile gesture of self-defense that Nolan immediately twisted into an accusation. He's resisting, Nolan yelled, lunging forward and grabbing Caleb's throat. I'm not, Caleb choked out, but his words were lost as Reed joined the assault, both officers now driving him to the ground. Caleb felt his knees scrape against the hard pavement, then his shoulder, as they crushed him down. Disoriented, he struggled against the weight, a desperate, instinctual movement they immediately used against him. Stop resisting, Reed shouted, his voice a performance for any unseen audience, creating a fiction that had no basis in reality. His knee dug into Caleb's back, forcing the air from his lungs as Nolan ground his head against the rough sidewalk. I'm not resisting, Caleb gasped, each word a desperate fight for breath. He could feel something warm and wet on his face, blood from the cut Nolan's punch had opened. Shut your mouth, Nolan hissed, pressing harder. You keep this up and it'll get a lot worse. The sheer insanity of it, that he, handcuffed and pinned by two grown men, was somehow the one fighting, might have been darkly funny in another world. But here, with his face bleeding onto the concrete and his chest so compressed he could barely breathe, Caleb understood with terrifying clarity how these stories ended for young men who looked like him. His father's voice cut through the fog of pain and panic. Stay alive. Nothing else matters. Just stay alive and get home. So Caleb forced his body to go limp, surrendering completely to their brutal weight, silencing the primal scream in his soul that told him to fight back. That's better, Reed said after a moment, a sickening satisfaction in his voice that turned Caleb's stomach. Now maybe you're ready to tell us who you really are. My name is Caleb Hayes, he repeated, his words slurred by his swelling lip. My father is Nathaniel Hayes, the state attorney general. We live at 347 Redwood Terrace. Reed grabbed a handful of Caleb's hair, yanking his head back. You're still on that? Even now? It's the truth, Caleb insisted, blinking blood out of his eye. Please, just take me home or call my father. The officers exchanged a look over his body, a silent communication he couldn't decipher. Then Reed nodded, and they hauled him brutally to his feet. All right, tough guy, Nolan said, shoving him toward the cruiser. You want to play this game? Fine. Let's sort it out downtown. As they neared the car, Caleb saw her, a woman walking a dog on the other side of the street, her face etched with concern. Their eyes met, and a desperate flicker of hope ignited in his chest. Ma'am, he called out, his voice strained. Please call Nathaniel Hayes at the Attorney General's office. Tell him his son Caleb is being. A sharp blow to his kidney cut him off, doubling him over in breathless agony. Shut your mouth, Reed hissed, forcing Caleb's head down as he shoved him into the back of the car. Nobody's calling anybody. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing with a terrible finality. Through the window, he saw the woman hesitate, her hand on her phone, as the officers spoke to her. Whatever lie they told her worked. After a moment, she turned and continued on her way, though she cast one last, troubled glance back. Inside the cruiser, separated by a plexiglass wall, Caleb finally allowed the crushing weight of it all to settle. His face was a throbbing mask of pain, blood still weeping from the cut that would soon be a spectacular bruise. His wrists burned from the too tight cuffs, his back ached where Reed's knee had ground into him. He gently touched his face, wincing at the puffy, tender skin. He thought of his father, dinner cold on the table, the initial annoyance turning to concern, then to worry, as the minutes stretched into an hour. A part of him wanted to scream, to rage, to break the windows with his bare hands. But his father's pragmatic voice was a steady anchor in the storm. This isn't the time to fight. This is the time to survive. You get through it, you come home, and then we fight back the right way. The engine roared to life, and the car pulled away, carrying him further and further from home. In the growing distance between where he was and where he was supposed to be, Caleb made a silent vow. He would survive this. And what these men had done tonight would not be forgotten. His father had taught him about justice as well as survival. And very soon, these two officers were going to learn exactly what that meant. The drive to the station was a painful blur, his mouth filled with the coppery taste of blood from his split lip. Through the partition, he could hear Reed and Nolan laughing, their casual conversation a sickening counterpoint to the violence they had just committed. His face throbbed in time with the engine's drone, the swelling already beginning to close his eye. "Bet he won't be spouting off about being the AG's kid anymore," Reed said, his voice loud enough to be a taunt. "These rich kids think they can talk to us however they want. Rich or poor, they all bleed." Nolan replied with a chuckle that made Caleb's skin crawl. "Gotta say, though, for an athlete, he folded pretty quick." The cruiser pulled into the station's lot, the harsh fluorescent lights of the building spilling across the asphalt. Reed yanked the back door open and hauled Caleb out by his arm, making him stumble. "Let's go, superstar," Reed growled, shoving him toward the entrance. "Time for your official welcome." The station buzzed with the mundane activity of a weeknight. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, officers moved with purpose. Heads turned as they marched him through the main area, his cuffed wrists and bloodied face a spectacle that drew every eye. Caleb stared straight ahead, clinging to a shred of dignity, aware that every person they passed was seeing a pre-written story, a young black man, clearly violent, who had resisted arrest. "Got a live one here, Sarge," Nolan called out as they neared the processing desk. "Suspicious activity, trespassing, resisting, and assaulting an officer." The desk sergeant, an older man named Miller with weary eyes and a face full of deep lines, looked up from his paperwork. His gaze shifted from the officers to Caleb, lingering on the boy's swollen, bleeding face. "Assaulted an officer, you say?" he asked, his tone flat, but his eyes sharp. "Which one?" "Both of us," Reed answered smoothly. "Kid went berserk when we questioned him in Redwood Heights. Started making up stories about living there, that his dad's the Attorney General. When we tried to detain him, he took a swing at Nolan." Sergeant Miller's eyebrows lifted a fraction as he measured Caleb's lean frame against the two hulking officers. "Is that right?" he asked, his question aimed directly at Caleb. Before Caleb could speak, Nolan's hand clamped down hard on his shoulder. "Don't waste your breath, Sarge. The kid's been telling fairy tales all night." The sergeant held Caleb's gaze for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression, before he turned back to his forms. "Name?" he asked, his pen poised. "Caleb Hayes," Caleb answered, his voice steady despite the pain pulsing in his face. "I live at 347 Redwood Terrace. My father is Nathaniel Hayes, the state attorney general. I was walking home from practice when these officers—" Nolan's grip tightened into a warning. "Still with that story? Unbelievable." Sergeant Miller's pen paused. "Hayes? Nathaniel Hayes' son?" He looked at Caleb again, more carefully this time, trying to see past the blood and the swelling. "That's his claim," Reed said dismissively. "Kid's a pathological liar." The sergeant frowned. "Did you verify his identity?" "He had no ID on him," Nolan said quickly. "Real convenient, huh?" "I was coming from basketball practice," Caleb repeated, sensing a crack of doubt in the sergeant. "My wallet is at home. Please, just call my father or drive me there." Reed stepped forward, physically blocking Caleb from the desk. "Look, Sarge, we have an uncooperative perp who was casing houses, resisted arrest, and assaulted us. We need to book him, not listen to his delusions." Sergeant Miller held Reed's stare for a long, tense moment before giving a slight nod. "Process him. Full booking." Caleb's hope withered as Reed grabbed his arm again, pulling him toward a hallway. "This way, Junior," he said with a smirk. "Time for your mugshot. Give us a big smile for Daddy." They took him to a processing room where a board technician took his photo and fingerprints. The procedure was cold and mechanical. "Stand here, face forward, turn left, turn right, press your fingers on the glass," all while the cuffs bit into his wrists, and the system worked to strip him of his identity. "Picture perfect," Nolan commented as the mugshot flashed on the screen, a harsh, clinical image of Caleb's swollen face. "That'll look great on your college applications." From there, they moved to an interrogation room, a small, windowless box with a metal table and 3 chairs bolted to the floor. Reed shoved Caleb into a chair, uncuffed him, and then immediately recuffed one wrist to a metal ring on the table. "Stay put," he ordered. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving Caleb alone in the humming silence of the sterile room. The fluorescent light above was a constant, buzzing glare. He gingerly touched his cheekbone, wincing. The skin was split where Nolan's knuckles had connected. It had mostly stopped bleeding but would definitely need stitches. He tried to gather his thoughts, to prepare for their return, but the pain and exhaustion made it impossible to focus. What had been a simple walk home had become a waking nightmare. He thought of his father. By now, the worry would have turned to frantic action. Calls to his phone would be going straight to voicemail. How long would it be before his father unleashed the full power of his office to find his missing son? The door flew open, startling him. Reed and Nolan walked back in, followed by a man in plain clothes, a detective, judging by the badge on his belt. The detective's eyes went straight to Caleb's face, a flicker of something, surprise? Anger, crossing his features before being replaced by a mask of professional neutrality. "So," the detective began, taking a seat across from Caleb while the 2 officers stood guard by the door. "I'm Detective Santiago. I hear we've had a bit of a night." "Yes, sir," Caleb replied, sitting up straighter. "These officers stopped me while I was walking home. When I told them who I was, they accused me of lying, they handcuffed me, and they assaulted me." He gestured to his face with his free hand. This was from Officer Nolan's fist. "I was not resisting." Reed stepped forward, his face flushed. "That's not what happened, Detective. The kid was acting suspicious. When we questioned him, he got hostile, then fought us when we tried to detain him." "I did not resist," Caleb countered, his voice firm. "I was following their instructions. Officer Nolan hit me after I muttered something. Then they both tackled me while I was already in handcuffs." Detective Santiago's gaze moved from Caleb to the officers, his expression unreadable. "Two very different stories," he observed. "What were you doing in Redwood Heights?" "I live there," Caleb repeated, his voice strained with the effort of holding back his frustration. 347 Redwood Terrace, with my father, Nathaniel Hayes. The Attorney General, Santiago stated, not a question, but a fact waiting for confirmation. "Yes, sir." Santiago turned to the officers. "Did you try to verify his address?" Nolan shifted his weight. "He had no ID. Claimed he left his wallet at home." "I was coming from basketball practice," Caleb explained for what felt like the 100th time. "I don't take my wallet to the gym." "And you didn't think to just drive him to the address he gave you?" Santiago asked the officers, his tone still carefully neutral. Reed interjected. "Detective, we had a suspicious person in a high-crime target area who became belligerent. Standard procedure is to bring him in for identification." Santiago nodded slowly, then looked back at Caleb. "You're entitled to a phone call. Who do you want to call?" Before Caleb could answer, the door swung open again. It was Sergeant Miller, his expression now tight with an unfamiliar tension. "Detective," he said, his eyes fixed on Santiago, ignoring the other officers. "The young man's phone call, it's already been made for him. His father is here." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Nolan's derisive snort. "Yeah, right. And I'm the commissioner." The sergeant's face was grim. "State Attorney General Nathaniel Hayes is in the lobby. He wants to see his son, and he wants to see the officers who arrested him. He's already spoken to the chief." The color drained from Reed's face. Santiago shot to his feet. "Uncuff him," the detective ordered, his voice suddenly sharp with urgency. "Now." Nolan hesitated, looking at Reed, who seemed paralyzed. "Detective procedure dictates." "I said uncuff him, officer." "Now." Santiago's tone left no room for debate. As Nolan fumbled with the key, a new sound echoed in the hallway, the sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps approaching with the force of an oncoming train. Caleb knew that rhythm instantly, the sound he'd heard 1,000 times on the staircase at home, in the polished halls of his father's office. The door opened again, and Nathaniel Hayes filled the doorway, 6'4" of controlled fury wrapped in a perfectly tailored suit. His eyes swept the room, taking in every detail in a single, terrifying second before they landed on his son's bruised and bloodied face. For a fleeting instant, a look of pure, raw anguish crossed his features, quickly replaced by the calm, unyielding mask that had made him a legend in the courtroom. "Caleb," he said, his deep voice surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the steel beneath it. "Are you all right?" That simple question, a father's question, not an attorney general's demand, nearly shattered Caleb's composure. He swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. "I'll be okay, Dad." Nathaniel nodded once, his gaze locked on his son's injuries before it shifted to the two officers, who now stood frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning terror. When he spoke again, his voice was so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. "Which one of you put your hands on my son?" The question hung in the air like a live wire, reverberating in the small interrogation room. Neither Reed nor Nolan moved, their earlier bravado having vanished completely under the Attorney General's piercing gaze. Detective Santiago stepped forward, trying to reclaim a situation that was spiraling out of control. "Mr. Attorney General, I'm Detective Santiago." "I was just beginning to, Detective." Nathaniel cut him off, his voice smooth but edged with steel. "I appreciate your presence, but my question was for them." His eyes snapped back to Reed and Nolan, who seemed to be communicating in panicked silence. "I will ask one more time. Which one of you struck my son?" Reed found his voice first, a weak imitation of his professional tone. "Sir, I'm Officer Reed. This is Officer Nolan. There was an altercation during the arrest. Your son was resisting. My son has a split cheekbone and his eye is nearly swollen shut." Nathaniel interrupted, his words sharp and precise. "That did not happen during an altercation. That happened because one of you hit him. Now, before I review the body camera footage, which I have already requested be preserved, I am giving you one chance to tell me yourself." The mention of body cams sent a visible shockwave through both officers. Nolan's jaw clenched. Reed's eyes darted to his partner. "The situation escalated," Reed offered, his voice strained. "Any force used was necessary to, Dad." Caleb's voice cut through the tension. "It was Officer Nolan. He hit me. Officer Reed held me down." Nathaniel nodded once, his focus never leaving the officers. "Thank you, Caleb." He turned to Detective Santiago. "I want my son released into my custody immediately. I want him taken to a hospital to have his injuries documented. And I want these two officers' badges and service weapons collected while a full and transparent investigation is launched." Santiago hesitated, torn between protocol and the raw power radiating from the state's highest law enforcement officer. "Sir, there are procedures." "I am well aware of the procedures, Detective," Nathaniel replied, his voice dangerously even. "I helped write most of them. What we have here are two officers who assaulted a minor and then filed a false report to cover it up. This has moved beyond procedure and into the realm of felony criminal conduct." A commotion in the hallway announced new arrivals. The police chief, red-faced and looking like he'd been woken from a deep sleep, appeared in the doorway, followed by a woman in a sharp suit Caleb recognized as his father's chief of staff, Lena Petrova. "Nathaniel," the chief began, his tone pleading. "Let's take this to my office. After my son has seen a doctor," Nathaniel countered, walking to Caleb and gently helping him stand. "And after these officers have been relieved of duty." He turned to Sergeant Miller, who was still hovering by the door. "Sergeant, please escort Officer Reed and Officer Nolan to Internal Affairs to surrender their equipment." The sergeant looked to the chief, who, after a long, pained moment, gave a grim nod. "Do it," he ordered. "And get Internal Affairs on the phone." As the two officers were led away, their faces pale with shock, Nathaniel finally allowed his full attention to return to his son, his eyes softening as he gently examined the damage to Caleb's face. "Let's get you to the hospital," he said quietly, his arm a protective shield around Caleb's shoulders. The drive to the emergency room was wrapped in a heavy silence. Nathaniel focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Caleb leaned his head against the cool glass of the window, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. The pain in his face was a constant, throbbing drumbeat. "I'm sorry, Dad," Caleb said softly as they pulled up to the hospital entrance. Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "What on earth could you possibly be sorry for?" "For not calling. For letting it get this far." Caleb gestured toward his own battered face. "You told me exactly how to handle these things, and I still ended up." "Caleb," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice gentle but absolute. "You did everything right. You survived. That's all that matters. Everything else is my fight now." The emergency room was relatively calm, and the presence of the Attorney General ensured they were seen immediately. A kind-eyed doctor meticulously cleaned and bandaged the cut on his cheek, confirming stitches weren't needed but documenting every bruise, every scrape, every contusion on his back and wrists from the cuffs and the takedown. "The orbital bone isn't fractured, you're lucky," she noted, her professional tone doing little to hide her anger. "But you're going to have a hell of a black eye. Rest, ice, and pain medication." While the doctor finished her report, Nathaniel stepped into the hall, his voice a low, controlled rumble as he made a series of calls, activating the full weight of his office. When he returned, his face was a mask of grim determination. "The hospital is fast-tracking copies of your medical records. Both officers have been placed on administrative leave pending the criminal investigation. And I've asked Elias to meet us at the house." Elias Croft, the family's friend and one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in the state. The mention of his name told Caleb this wasn't just about discipline. His father was preparing for war. The drive home was a blur of more phone calls, Nathaniel's voice shifting from the precise authority of the Attorney General to the concerned tones of a husband updating his wife, who was waiting at home. When they finally pulled into the driveway on Redwood Terrace, the very home the officers had refused to believe was his, it was nearly midnight. Caleb's mother, Isabel Hayes, a federal judge whose composure was as legendary as her husband's, let out a sharp, audible gasp as she saw her son's face under the bright entryway lights. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, her arms wrapping around him in a fierce hug before her gaze hardened with the same cold fury he'd seen in his father's eyes. "They will answer for this," she said. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement of fact. Elias Croft arrived minutes later, his usual easy smile replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. As the adults gathered in the living room, Caleb found himself recounting the night's events for the third time, the details sharp and clear in his mind: the stop, the disbelief, the escalating aggression, the punch, the lies. "They didn't believe you lived here?" Elias asked, shaking his head in disbelief. "They didn't want to believe him," Nathaniel corrected, his voice tight with rage. This was never about suspicion. It was about power. They saw a young black man in their territory and decided he didn't belong. When Caleb refused to accept their narrative, they used force. Isabel, who had been taking meticulous notes, looked up. "The witness? The woman with the dog?" Caleb nodded. "She saw them put me in the car. I tried to call out to her, but they hit me again and drove off." "We'll find her," Elias said with grim confidence. "Between her testimony, the body cams, and these medical records, we will build a case so airtight it will be a coffin." As the legal strategy session continued around him, Caleb felt a strange sense of detachment. He'd grown up with conversations like this, a byproduct of being raised by two of the sharpest legal minds in the state, but he'd never been the subject. The victim. The exhibit. A memory surfaced of his father sitting him down when he was 12, after another boy with dark skin had been killed for playing with a toy gun. "The world will not always see the young man I know," Nathaniel had told him, his voice heavy with the truth passed down through generations. "They won't see your heart, or your grades, or your talent. Some people will only see a threat. It is not right. It is not fair. But knowing it, preparing for it, might one day save your life. 5 years later, that lesson had done exactly that. His compliance, his calm, his strategic use of his father's name, he had played the game perfectly, and he had still ended up beaten and cuffed in the back of a police car. The sheer injustice of it burned in his chest. Caleb needs to rest, Isabel finally said, noticing his drooping eyelids. We can continue this in the morning. Nathaniel agreed, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. Go on up, son. We'll handle it from here. As Caleb walked upstairs, the quiet, furious murmur of his parents and their lawyer followed him, voices already shifting from fact-finding to battle planning, mobilizing a lifetime of connections and power to turn his personal trauma into a public reckoning. And despite the pain, a new feeling began to take root inside him. This wasn't just about him. It was a symptom of a sickness. He had been taught to survive. But now he realized survival was only the first step. What came next, the accountability, the fight, the refusal to let it happen again, that was where the real change began. With that thought, he finally let sleep take him, knowing that when the sun rose, the war for justice would begin. As dawn broke, the Hayes home was already a hive of activity. Nathaniel was in his home office, a general marshalling his forces. Elias Croft was meticulously photographing Caleb's injuries for evidence. Isabel had converted the dining room into a command center, fielding calls and coordinating with legal colleagues. Caleb sat at the kitchen island, an ice pack pressed to his cheek, watching his parents orchestrate the response with a kind of exhausted awe. The family's housekeeper, Mrs. Rossi, hovered over him, her face a mask of worry. You should be resting, Mijo, she said softly, placing a mug of tea beside him. Your parents have this. I know, Caleb replied, a faint smile touching his swollen lips. But I have to be a part of it. The doorbell announced the arrival of Lena Petrova, his father's chief of staff, and a grim-faced man from the department's Internal Affairs Division. Their hushed conversation in the foyer was a litany of damning evidence. The body cam footage is secured, the IA director said. A preliminary review confirms your son's account in its entirety. It is indefensible. William nodded, unsurprised. I want formal charges drawn up by noon. Assault, false imprisonment, filing a false report, civil rights violations. The full spectrum. No paid leave, no quiet resignations. They will face the consequences. The house phone rang, and Isabel's voice shifted from maternal concern to judicial authority in a heartbeat. Yes, Governor. We appreciate the call. Yes, Caleb is recovering. Nathaniel will be making a formal statement this morning. It was in that moment, hearing his mother speak with the governor, that Caleb grasped how fast his private nightmare had become a public crisis. The vast machinery of justice, the system his parents served, was now mobilizing around him. Nathaniel returned to the kitchen, his expression softening as he looked at his son. They're calling the officers in now, he said. They still don't know the storm that's about to break. I want you to rest, but if you're able, a formal statement from you this morning would be invaluable. Caleb straightened, removing the ice pack. I'm ready, he said, a newfound conviction in his voice. I want to tell them everything. 2 hours later, Caleb sat in his father's expansive office at the Department of Justice, his signed and recorded statement now official evidence. The building hummed with an unusual energy. Staff moved with quiet urgency, phones rang off the hook, and the whispers of the incident spread through the halls. The press conference is set for 10 a.m. Lena informed Nathaniel, holding up a tablet showing a dozen breaking news alerts. It's already all over social media. Someone at the hospital leaked a photo of Caleb from the ER. Nathaniel scowled, glancing at his son. Inevitable. At least it documents the injuries. He handed the tablet to Caleb, who stared at a grainy photo of his own bruised face under the harsh fluorescent lights. The headline read, AG's son allegedly beaten by police. They've both been placed on unpaid administrative leave. Lena continued. Reed is already on the phone with his union rep. Nolan actually showed up for his shift this morning, completely oblivious. A knock on the door announced Captain Eva Rostova, the police chief's deputy, a woman tasked with navigating the departmental minefield. Her face was professionally blank, but the tension in her shoulders was palpable. "The officers have arrived at headquarters, sir," she reported. "They know they're under investigation, but they haven't seen the footage." Nathaniel nodded, rising from his desk. "Keep them in separate rooms. I'm on my way." He turned to Caleb. "You don't have to be there for this." Caleb stood up, the pain in his face a dull, constant reminder. "I want to be there," he said firmly. "I want them to see me." The corridors of police headquarters felt charged with electricity as Nathaniel led the way, with Caleb, Elias, and Lena forming a protective phalanx around him. Officers they passed snapped to attention, their eyes darting from the Attorney General to his son's bruised face. The news had clearly spread like wildfire. Captain Rostova met them at the elevator. "Attorney General, we've put Officer Reed in Conference Room A and Officer Nolan in Conference Room B, as you requested. The chief is en route." Nathaniel gave a curt nod. "Which room is Reed in?" "Conference Room A, sir." The elevator ride was silent and tense, Caleb's father radiating a controlled fury that was almost a physical presence in the small space. The doors opened onto an administrative floor lined with glass-walled conference rooms. Through one, Caleb could see Officer Reed, sitting alone, looking nervous. He no longer seemed like an intimidating giant, stripped of his authority. He just looked like a man who knew he was in trouble. When he looked up and saw Caleb standing next to the Attorney General, his face went white. "I'll speak with Officer Reed first," Nathaniel stated, his voice calm but unforgiving. "Caleb, you can wait out here." "No," Caleb said, his voice steady. "I'm coming in. I want him to look at what he did." As they entered, Reed shot to his feet out of habit. "Sir," he began, his voice tight. "I understand there's been some confusion about last night's arrest." Nathaniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "Confusion? Is that what you call this?" He gestured to Caleb's face, the bruises a vivid constellation of purple and black under the office lighting. "My son was assaulted while handcuffed. That is not confusion, Officer Reed. That is a felony." Reed swallowed hard, his eyes flickering between them. "Sir, with all due respect, the situation was dynamic. We had reports of suspicious activity, and when we encountered your son, he was uncooperative. Because I was trying to walk home from basketball practice," Caleb interjected, his gaze locking with Reed's. "I told you who I was. I told you where I lived. You decided not to believe me." Elias Croft stepped forward, placing a folder on the table. "Officer Reed, we've reviewed the body camera footage. At no point did Caleb resist. At no point was he aggressive. It does, however, clearly show your partner striking him without provocation while he was restrained." Reed's composure finally cracked. "Attorney General, I want to be clear. I did not strike your son. That was Officer Nolan. But you did nothing to stop him," Nathaniel observed, his voice like ice. "You then participated in tackling my handcuffed son, you filed a false report claiming he resisted, and you processed charges you knew were fraudulent." Reed's gaze fell to the table. "I was following procedure for a suspicious individual." "A suspicious individual?" Nathaniel's voice rose for the first time. "He is a 17-year-old boy walking home in his own neighborhood. An address he gave you correctly, repeatedly. Which part of your procedure involves beating a child?" Reed had no answer. He just sat there, deflated. Caleb watched him, feeling a strange emptiness instead of triumph. The power dynamic had flipped so completely it was dizzying. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. "If I wasn't the Attorney General's son, what would have happened to me?" The question hung in the room, heavy and sharp. Reed looked away before answering with a quiet, terrible honesty. "You would have been processed. Resisting arrest, maybe assault on an officer. With a clean record, probably probation. For walking home." Caleb stated, his voice flat. For being in my own neighborhood. Nathaniel placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Officer Reed, you and Officer Nolan are being placed on unpaid administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation. Your service weapons and badges will be surrendered before you leave this building. Criminal investigation? Reed echoed, his face a mask of panic. Sir, surely this is an internal matter. An internal matter? Nathaniel cut him off. Like the internal process that would have saddled my son with a criminal record for the rest of his life? No. This will be handled in a court of law, with full transparency. Captain Rostova stepped forward from the doorway. I'll escort Officer Reed to surrender his equipment. As Reed was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, Caleb felt no joy, only a cold resolve. It wasn't the man's downfall that mattered. It was the casual certainty with which he described what would have happened to any other kid. You all right? William asked quietly. Caleb nodded. Yeah. It's just strange. Seeing him like that. Power is a fragile thing when confronted with accountability, William said. Ready for the next one? Absolutely, Caleb replied, his shoulders squared. Let's finish this. Officer Nolan sat alone in the second conference room, a mask of defiant bravado on his face that did little to hide the anxiety in his eyes. Unlike Reed, he still carried himself with a stubborn swagger, as if he truly believed he'd done nothing wrong. That swagger evaporated the moment Nathaniel Hayes walked in, with Caleb at his side, his bruised face a silent, irrefutable accusation. Officer Nolan, Nathaniel began, his voice a low, dangerous hum. I believe we have some things to discuss. Nolan's eyes darted between them, recognition and alarm warring on his face. Sir, I understand there's a complaint, but I followed all departmental procedures. Procedure for what, exactly? Nathaniel asked, gesturing to a chair but remaining standing himself. For assaulting a minor in handcuffs? For filing a false police report? For fabricating criminal charges? Enlighten me as to which procedure covers those actions. Elias Croft placed a laptop on the table and turned it on. The screen lit up with a freeze frame from the body camera footage, the exact moment Nolan's fist connected with Caleb's cheek. We've seen the footage, Officer Nolan. All of it. There is no version of events where you are not at fault. Nolan stared at the image, his composure finally cracking. That doesn't show the context. The suspect was resisting. The suspect is my son, Nathaniel stated flatly. And he was handcuffed and fully compliant when you struck him. The video and audio confirm that. With respect, sir, Nolan countered, his voice sharp with defiance. We didn't know he was your son. He was in a wealthy neighborhood, no ID, giving us lip. Lip? Caleb echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. I told you my name. I told you my address. I did everything you asked. The only lip was me refusing to agree I was a criminal for walking down my own street. Nolan's gaze hardened as he looked directly at Caleb. You muttered something under your breath. You tensed up. I flinched because you were hurting me. Caleb shot back, his voice unwavering. And even if I had said something, does that justify you punching a handcuffed teenager in the face? Nathaniel's hand rested on Caleb's shoulder. Officer, the footage shows you striking my son with a force that could have fractured his orbital bone. It shows you and your partner tackling him to the ground while he was already helpless. It shows you lying on an official report. These are not matters of opinion. They are documented facts. Something inside Nolan seemed to snap. Look, he said, leaning forward. Maybe it got a little heated, okay? But this is what we deal with every day. Kids mouthing off, lying about where they live. 99% of the time, our gut is right. And that justifies assault? Nathaniel asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Nolan's face hardened again. With all due respect, sir, you sit in an office. You don't know what it's like on the street. We have to make split-second decisions. I am very familiar with the realities of police work, Officer Nolan, Nathaniel replied, his tone dropping several degrees. Just as I'm familiar with your service record. 3 excessive force complaints in the last 2 years. All against young black men. All of them dismissed internally. The color drained from Nolan's face. You've been digging into my record? I am the Attorney General, Nathaniel reminded him. It's my job. And what I see is a pattern of behavior, not an isolated mistake. Captain Rostova stepped forward. Officer Nolan, you are being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation. You will surrender your badge and service weapon. A criminal investigation? Nolan repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. For doing my job? Your job does not include assaulting children. Nathaniel cut in, his patience gone. Nor does it include perjury. These are crimes, Officer Nolan, and you will be treated like a criminal. Nolan's hateful gaze shifted to Caleb. So this is it? The AG's kid gets special treatment. Must be nice. Caleb stiffened, but his father's voice cut through the air like a whip. Let me be perfectly clear, officer. This is not special treatment. This is accountability. The fact that he is my son means I have the resources to ensure that accountability is swift and absolute. But make no mistake, I would pursue this with the same vigor for any child in this state. He leaned forward, his presence filling the room. And if you believe for 1 second that this is about privilege, you fundamentally misunderstand both me and the office I hold. Captain Rostova stepped forward again. Officer Nolan. With me. Now. For a moment, it looked as if Nolan might refuse, but he finally stood, his shoulders slumping as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. This isn't right, he muttered as he was led to the door. This isn't how it's supposed to work. As he passed, Caleb spoke one last time, his voice clear and steady. Officer Nolan. I want you to know something. If I wasn't the Attorney General's son, you would have gotten away with this, just like the other times. That's what isn't right. Nolan had no reply. As he was led away, Elias Croft began packing up his laptop. That went as expected, he said grimly. In their minds, their only mistake was picking the wrong kid. Nathaniel turned to his son. Caleb, how are you holding up? I'm okay, Caleb said, though a deep weariness was settling into his bones. What's next? Next, William said, glancing at his watch. We prepare for the press conference. A press conference? Caleb asked, the reality of his father's public life crashing into his private trauma. Yes, William confirmed, his expression softening. This isn't just about you anymore, Caleb. This is about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And that means we have to make it public. He paused, studying his son's bruised face. But you don't have to be there if you don't want to be. No, Caleb said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. I want to be there. I want everyone to see what they did. William nodded, a flicker of immense pride in his eyes. All right then. Let's make sure they see. As they walked out of the conference room, the station was in a state of controlled chaos. What had started as a boy's walk home had become a firestorm. And as Caleb followed his father toward the next battle, he felt the weight of it all settle on his shoulders. This was no longer just his story. It was the story of all the others who didn't have an attorney general for a father. And for them, he would stand, and he would let his bruised face tell the truth. The chief's office was an island of quiet in the storm of the station. Chief Rollins, a man who looked like he'd aged a decade overnight, sat behind his desk as Nathaniel Hayes laid out the terms of surrender. The investigation will be run by my office to ensure complete impartiality, Nathaniel stated, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. I want a full review of both officers' service records, every complaint, every commendation, nothing held back. Rollins nodded, his face grim. Of course, Attorney General. You have my department's full cooperation. And I want to extend my deepest, most sincere apologies to your son. While the adults talked, Caleb stood by the window, watching as news vans began to assemble in the parking lot like vultures. He gently touched his swollen cheek, the dull ache a constant reminder of the night before. His father's voice pulled him back. The chief has given us a few minutes of privacy before the press conference. As the others filed out, William took the seat next to Caleb, foregoing the chief's imposing chair. How are you really? He asked, the Attorney General gone, replaced fully by his father. Caleb thought for a moment. I'm fine doesn't really cover it, he admitted. I'm tired. And angry. And confused. About how fast it all changed. Last night they had all the power. And now, it's all flipped, just because of who you are. I know, William said softly. The system works differently depending on who you are. That is the definition of injustice. So what about everyone else? Caleb asked, the question that had been haunting him. The ones who don't have you for a father? That, William said, his gaze intense, is why what we do next is so important. This isn't just about you, Caleb. It's about using this moment, this window of attention, to force a change that lasts. The activity outside the office was escalating. Internal affairs investigators had arrived and were setting up in a conference room, their presence sending ripples of anxiety through the station. What's the plan? Caleb asked. First, criminal charges, William said without hesitation. They will face a jury. Second, a full, public review of this department's policies on use of force and racial profiling. Public hearings where other people can tell their stories. He paused. And that's where you have a choice. Your story, your face, it has power. But being the face of this comes with a cost. They will try to tear you down, to discredit you. Caleb thought of Officer Nolan's sneering words, the AG's kid gets special treatment. It had stung because it was true. His father's power meant justice for him. But what about the others? I want to speak, Caleb said, his voice firm. At the press conference, at the hearings. People need to see this. Pride warred with concern on his father's face. Are you sure? Once this door opens, there's no closing it. I'm sure, Caleb said. You always told me privilege isn't a prize, it's a responsibility. This is my responsibility. William placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Then we do it together. A knock at the door signaled their time was up. Diane Chin entered. Sir, the press conference is ready. We have every major network. The governor called again. He's on our side. She gave Caleb a sympathetic look. The body cam footage is ready to go. Michael thinks we should show the clip of the punch. William looked at his son. Your call, Caleb. It's your trauma. Caleb didn't hesitate. Show it. Show all of it. Let them see what happened. As another knock announced the arrival of the police union representative, William stood. Tell him I'll meet with him after, he said firmly. This is not a negotiation. He looked at his son, whose bruised face was now a symbol of something so much bigger than a single night. Ready? William asked. Caleb drew himself to his full height. Ready. Together, they walked out of the quiet office and into the heart of the storm they were about to unleash. Father and son, bound by a shared resolve to make sure a night of injustice would become a catalyst for a generation of change. The press room was a feeding frenzy, a crush of cameras and microphones and shouted questions that fell into a sudden, stunned silence as Nathaniel entered with Caleb at his side. The sea of flashes was blinding as photographers captured the image, the powerful Attorney General and the living, breathing evidence of the crime. Nathaniel stepped to the podium, his voice ringing with cold authority. Last night, my 17-year-old son Caleb was walking home from basketball practice when he was stopped by officers Frank Nolan and Thomas Reed. Despite complying with all instructions, he was handcuffed, physically assaulted, and arrested on fraudulent charges. He gestured to Caleb, whose bruised face told the story more powerfully than any words could. The entire incident was captured on body camera footage, leaving no room for doubt. While my son was restrained and helpless, Officer Nolan struck him in the face. Both officers then tackled him to the ground and filed a false report. As of this morning, my office is filing felony criminal charges against both men. They have been suspended without pay and have surrendered their badges. But this is just the beginning. Nathaniel's eyes scanned the room, his gaze hard as granite. What happened to my son is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a systemic disease. And today, I am announcing a full, state-led investigation into this department's policies, training, and history of civilian complaints. There will be public hearings. There will be subpoenas. And I am putting every department in this state on notice. There will be zero tolerance for this kind of conduct on my watch. The room erupted. William held up a hand for silence. Before I take questions, my son would like to make a statement. He stepped back, putting a supportive hand on Caleb's shoulder. As Caleb moved to the microphone, the room fell silent again. He looked out at the faces, his own face a mask of calm composure. Last night, he began, his voice clear and strong. 2 police officers stopped me while I was walking home. I told them who I was. I did everything they said. I kept my hands visible. I didn't resist. He lightly touched his bruised cheek. This happened anyway. The simple truth of it hung in the air. I am standing here today because my father is the Attorney General. I have a voice and a platform that most people in this situation do not. But what happened to me happens every single day to people who don't have someone in power to fight for them. So I am asking you to listen. Not just to my story, but to all the stories that go unheard. What happened to me was wrong. What happens to others like me is wrong. And it has to stop. He stepped back, the emotional weight of his words palpable. Then the dam broke, and a torrent of questions flooded the room. William returned to the podium, expertly fielding the barrage while Caleb stood beside him, a silent, powerful testament to the truth. Outside, the story was exploding across the airwaves, his bruised face on every screen, his voice carrying into every home. What had begun as a single, brutal encounter was now a public reckoning, a moment of undeniable truth that could no longer be ignored. Caleb stood tall next to his father, understanding that his pain was no longer just his own. It was now a responsibility, a platform, and a chance to speak for the voiceless. The weight was heavy, but as the cameras flashed, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. 1 week later, Caleb stood before the bathroom mirror, the bruise on his cheek now a fading map of yellow and green. The past 7 days had been a whirlwind. Officers Nolan and Reed were formally charged, their mugshots appearing next to Caleb's bruised face on every news site. The police union, after a brief, blustering defense, had fallen silent in the face of the damning body cam footage. Chief Rollins had announced his early retirement, and Captain Rostova had been named interim chief with a clear mandate for reform. The house was still a command center, but a fragile sense of normalcy was beginning to return. "How are you feeling?" his mother asked as he entered the kitchen. "Better," Caleb said, and for the first time, it felt true. His father ended a call. "Ready for today?" Today was his first day back at school. His private trauma was now public knowledge. As his father drove him to campus, they saw the news van parked across the street. "Call me if you need anything," William said. Caleb braced himself and stepped out of the car. The hallways were a sea of whispers and stolen glances. It wasn't until he stepped onto the basketball court for practice that the tension finally broke. "Caleb's been through something none of us should have to face," Coach Davies told the team. "On this court, he's just one of us. We have his back." The simple, direct words were a relief. For 2 hours he wasn't a symbol or a victim. He was just a basketball player. After practice, his father and Elias Croft were waiting. Internal Affairs has uncovered 12 similar, buried complaints against Nolan and Reed, Elias told them on the drive home. "We've been contacted by attorneys for 3 of the other victims. They're willing to testify." The story was growing, expanding, becoming a chorus of voices that had been ignored for too long. That evening, their living room was transformed into a television studio for a national news interview. "Many have called you courageous for speaking out," the anchor said to him. "How do you see your role?" Caleb answered carefully. "I don't see it as courage. I see it as a responsibility. If my story can help stop this from happening to someone else, then that's what I have to do. And you, Attorney General? Bianca asked his father. How do you balance your role as the state's top law enforcement officer with being the father of a victim of police brutality? William's expression was unshakable. There is no conflict. My job is to pursue justice. My duty as a father is to protect my son. In this case, those two things are perfectly aligned. What was done to my son was a crime. And I will see that justice is done, for him and for every citizen of this state. After the cameras were gone, the house was quiet again. You did well today, his father said, pride in his voice. Do you think it will actually make a difference? Caleb asked. Yes, William answered. Not as much as it should, and not as fast as we want. But moments like this, when something hidden is dragged into the light, this is how change begins. Your voice made that happen. 3 weeks later, Caleb stood at the free throw line, the game tied, seconds left on the clock. The bruise was gone, but the story was still unfolding. Nolan and Reed had been fired, and the public hearings were scheduled to begin next month, with Caleb as the first to testify. He saw his father in the stands, and they shared a look of understanding across the crowded gym. He took a breath, released the ball, and watched it swish cleanly through the net. The crowd roared, his teammates mobbed him, and for a moment, he was just a kid who had won the game. But as he looked at his father's proud smile, he knew he was something more. He was a young man who had faced injustice and had chosen to fight back. The path ahead was long, but he faced it with a new clarity. Justice, he had learned, wasn't given. It was demanded. As the final buzzer sounded, he felt a sense of balance. He was the athlete celebrating a victory, and he was the activist committed to a cause larger than himself. Justice had been served, but the work was just beginning. And Caleb Hayes, in every sense his father's son, was ready. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.